The bustling shopping mall was alive with the usual weekend buzz. Families shuffled through stores, couples strolled hand in hand, and kids darted between aisles, their laughter echoing through the wide corridors. Amid the vibrant chaos, a particular scene was quietly unfolding in a trendy boutique near the food court. The shopper, a tall man dressed casually but neatly, was browsing through racks of clothing, focused and calm. He picked up a jacket, examining the fabric with the practiced eye of someone who valued quality. His demeanor was unassuming, his movements deliberate, but it didn't take long for him to notice the piercing gaze locked onto him from across the store. A woman stood near the entrance, her arms crossed tightly over her designer sweater. Her expression was sharp and scrutinizing, her eyes narrowing each time the man reached for another item. Her energy was palpable, one of judgment, suspicion, and something else. She was on edge, and the tension radiating from her presence seemed to create a bubble of unease that cut through the light-hearted chatter around them. She didn't try to hide her disapproval, shifting her weight impatiently and glancing at the store clerk, as if waiting for them to intervene. When nothing happened, her irritation boiled over. She pulled out her phone, dialing a number with purpose. Moments later, she was speaking in a hushed but agitated tone. Her words were clipped and accusatory. "Yes, security? There's a suspicious man in the boutique near the food court. He's acting odd. Yes, he's still here. You should hurry before something happens." The shopper was unaware of the call at first, too engrossed in comparing two shirts to notice the woman's escalating actions. But soon, the atmosphere around him shifted. He felt it, the weight of unwelcome eyes. When he turned, he saw her glaring openly now, her phone still pressed to her ear. She didn't flinch when their eyes met. Instead, she spoke louder, her voice dripping with false urgency. "He's looking right at me now. Please send someone immediately." It was a scene that could have played out like so many others, an ugly misunderstanding fueled by prejudice and assumptions. But today, the universe had other plans. Because what this woman didn't know was that she was about to get an unexpected lesson in kindness, resilience, and humanity. As security guards approached, the air in the boutique grew heavier. Shoppers began to notice, whispers spreading like wildfire. The shopper set the shirts down calmly, his face unreadable as he prepared to address what was happening. The woman smirked triumphantly, sure she'd done the right thing. But what she thought would end with humiliation and blame for someone else was about to take a turn no one in that store could have predicted. The security guards entered the boutique with measured steps, their radios crackling softly as they approached. Their presence immediately drew the attention of everyone in the store. Conversations paused, and eyes darted between the shopper, the woman, and the guards. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. The shopper turned to face the guards, his expression calm but guarded. He didn't make a scene, didn't raise his voice or question why they were there. Instead, he stepped away from the rack of clothes and stood quietly, waiting for them to speak. It was a reaction that seemed to catch even the guards off guard. "Excuse me, sir," one of the guards began, his tone professional but cautious. "We received a report about some suspicious activity in the store. We'd just like to ask you a few questions." The shopper nodded slowly, his voice even and composed. "Of course. I'm happy to answer any questions." The woman, still hovering near the entrance, crossed her arms and muttered loudly enough for others to hear, "About time. I was starting to think no one was going to do anything." Her tone was sharp, laced with satisfaction. She clearly believed her actions were justified and that the situation would end in her favor. The guards glanced at her briefly but didn't acknowledge her comment. Their attention remained on the shopper, who didn't flinch under their scrutiny. "Can you tell us what you're doing in the store today?" one guard asked, his voice neutral. "Just shopping," the man replied simply. He gestured to the rack he had been browsing. "I'm looking for a gift for my brother." It's his birthday next week. The guard nodded, his expression thoughtful. Do you have any items with you now that you're planning to purchase? No, the shopper said, shaking his head. I was just comparing a few things. I haven't made any decisions yet. The second guard, who had been scanning the surrounding area, stepped closer. Do you have an ID with you, sir? The shopper reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet, carefully handing over his ID. The guards examined it briefly, their expressions unreadable. Meanwhile, the woman's confidence seemed to grow. She stepped closer to the guards, her voice dripping with disdain as she said, I saw him acting suspiciously, looking around like he was up to something. You can't be too careful these days, you know. The shopper turned his gaze to her, his expression still calm but now tinged with something else, disappointment, maybe. He didn't interrupt her, didn't defend himself. He simply let her words hang in the air. The guards exchanged a glance, their demeanor professional but slightly wary. They handed the ID back to the shopper and asked, Do you mind if we take a quick look in your bag, just to clear things up? The shopper nodded, unzipping the small backpack slung over his shoulder and holding it open for them. The guards carefully inspected the contents, just a book, a water bottle, and a folded umbrella. Nothing out of the ordinary. Satisfied, they stepped back and handed the bag back to him. Thank you for your cooperation, sir, the first guard said. You're free to continue shopping. The woman's jaw dropped, her face flushing with a mix of anger and disbelief. What do you mean, free to continue? Didn't you see how he was acting? I wouldn't be surprised if he was planning to. Ma'am, the second guard interrupted, his tone firm but polite. We've investigated the situation and found no cause for concern. If you have any further issues, please let us know, but at this time, there's nothing to address. The woman sputtered, clearly unsatisfied with the outcome. But look at him. The shopper finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying a quiet strength. Look at me, indeed, he said, his gaze meeting hers. What exactly do you see? For a moment, the boutique was silent, the weight of his question hanging in the air. The woman opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, her words faltering under the scrutiny of the now watching crowd. The shopper didn't wait for an answer. He picked up the jacket he'd been examining earlier and walked toward the checkout counter, his stride confident and unbothered. The guards exchanged another glance before following him, their presence a quiet but unmistakable statement that the situation had been handled. The woman, left standing near the entrance, looked around the store, her earlier smugness replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Whispers from the other shoppers reached her ears, their tones ranging from disbelief to quiet judgment. For the first time, she seemed to realize that the tide of opinion might not be in her favor. As the shopper paid for his item and left the boutique, a few of the onlookers exchanged nods of acknowledgement with him, small gestures of support that didn't go unnoticed. The woman, however, lingered, her confidence shaken but her resolve not entirely broken. She still believed she was in the right, even as the evidence and the mood of the room suggested otherwise. But what she didn't know was that this moment was far from over. The events of the day would ripple far beyond the walls of the boutique, leading to revelations and consequences she could never have anticipated. As the shopper exited the boutique, the air outside felt lighter, though the tension still clung to the store like a shadow. He made his way down the bustling corridor, the sound of his footsteps echoing as he passed by other shoppers lost in their own world. He felt a quiet sense of relief, but also something else, an unease that had begun to settle in his chest, a sense that this moment was far from over. What had just happened wasn't just about a mistaken accusation or a call to security. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond the walls of this shopping mall, something he had experienced more times than he cared to admit. A part of him wished he could just forget it and move on, but it was hard to shake the feeling that what had just occurred was part of a larger, more insidious cycle. Inside the boutique, the woman stood frozen for a few moments, her gaze fixed on the exit where the shopper had disappeared. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as if trying to ground herself in the wake of what had just transpired. She was angry, humiliated even, but above all, she was confused. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In her mind, she had done the right thing. She had seen something she didn't trust, and she acted on it. But now, as she stood there, she couldn't shake the growing feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had gotten it wrong. Her gaze shifted back to the guards, who were speaking with a couple of other employees nearby, discussing the situation in low tones. She wanted to storm over and demand answers, to push her case harder, but something held her back. The crowd that had gathered earlier was slowly dissipating, people returning to their shopping, their whispers trailing off as the incident faded into the background. She was left standing there, her pride taking a hit, and her conviction faltering. But there was still a part of her that wouldn't let go. She had felt a strange discomfort in the shopper's presence, an intuition that something wasn't right. Her mind replayed the moments before she had called security, the way he had been eyeing the store, the way he'd moved through the aisles like he was casing the place. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been justified, even if everything else seemed to suggest otherwise. She had to be right, didn't she? Back in the mall's food court, the shopper found a quiet corner and sat down at a table. His fingers tapped nervously on the surface, his mind swirling with thoughts that wouldn't settle. He glanced around, taking in the familiar sights: the groups of teenagers laughing, the elderly couple enjoying their lunch, the young mother balancing a stroller and a coffee. It all felt so normal. But the incident, the woman's accusation, lingered in his mind, a dark cloud hanging over an otherwise mundane afternoon. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It wasn't the first time he'd been judged by someone who assumed the worst of him simply because of how he looked. His heart sank as he thought about the countless times he'd been followed in stores, questioned when he'd done nothing wrong, and treated with suspicion for no reason other than the color of his skin. He had learned to live with it, to brush it off, but moments like this still stung. His fingers ran over the fabric of the jacket he had just purchased. It wasn't expensive, just a simple item he had been eyeing for a while. But now, as he sat there in the quiet corner of the food court, he couldn't help but feel as though it was a symbol of something much larger, of the unfairness that seemed to follow him everywhere. His breath caught in his throat as the anger began to rise again, but he quickly swallowed it down. He didn't want to give in to that anger. He didn't want to let it consume him. But then his thoughts were interrupted by the sharp buzz of his phone. He glanced at the screen, his stomach tightening when he saw the name on the caller ID. It was his cousin. He had to take the call. His cousin had been there for him through a lot, especially when things got rough. He answered the phone with a quick, "Hey, what's up? You okay?" His cousin's voice came through, laced with concern. "I just saw something online. There's a video circulating about what happened at the mall. A woman called security on you, right?" The shopper's heart sank. He hadn't expected this. The incident hadn't just ended with the guards walking away, it was already making its way through the grapevine. "I'm fine," he said, trying to sound casual, though the words felt hollow. "Just another day, you know?" "You don't sound fine," his cousin pressed. "This is going viral, man. People are talking about it. And I'm seeing some pretty nasty stuff being said. You need to be careful." He ran a hand over his face, trying to steady himself. The last thing he wanted was for this to spiral further. He didn't want to be the face of some unjustified confrontation. He just wanted to move on. But now that the video was out there, things were spiraling fast, and there was no going back. He could already feel the weight of people's eyes on him, even if they weren't in the mall anymore. "Yeah, I know," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there's nothing I can do about it now." "Don't say that. You've got to speak up." This is bigger than just one store. It's about what's happening everywhere. People need to see what's going on. His cousin's words echoed in his mind, and despite his desire to avoid confrontation, he couldn't shake the sense that maybe, just maybe, this was a moment where he had to stand up not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever felt like they were treated unfairly because of how they looked. As he hung up the phone, he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. His legs felt heavy, and his mind was racing. He wanted to leave the mall and forget about it all, but he knew that wasn't an option anymore. This wasn't just about what had happened in the store. It was about a larger story, a story that wasn't finished yet. And as much as he tried to ignore it, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was about to be pulled into something much bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Meanwhile, the woman had retreated to her car, the video still playing in her head. She kept replaying the moment she called security, her thoughts now a tangled mess of confusion and doubt. She couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease, something about the way the guards had dismissed her, something about the way the shopper had looked at her, almost as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. It made her skin crawl. But what bothered her the most wasn't the fact that she might have been wrong. No, what bothered her was the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, she had been right all along, and the consequences of her actions were far from over. She couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't just made a mistake, she had made a decision that would haunt her. As she sat in her car, staring out at the busy mall parking lot, she couldn't help but feel like the story had only just begun. And she wasn't sure where it would lead, but one thing was certain, she would not be the same after this. The days following the incident felt like they stretched on forever. The video of the confrontation in the boutique had gone viral faster than anyone could have imagined. By the time the shopper left the mall that afternoon, his face was already plastered across social media, with opinions flying left and right. Some defended him, others lambasted the woman for making an unfounded accusation. But for every person who voiced their support, there was another who questioned his innocence, casting doubt and fueling the fire. The shopper had been hesitant to read the comments, knowing that doing so would only feed his frustration. But the pressure of the situation was mounting. He couldn't escape it. His phone buzzed relentlessly, with notifications pouring in from family members, friends, even strangers, urging him to speak up, to take action, to make his story known. Still, there was a part of him that wanted to disappear, to let the world move on without him. He'd learned to navigate the world with a certain level of caution, avoiding situations that could lead to unnecessary conflict. But now, it felt as though conflict had found him, whether he wanted it or not. Meanwhile, the woman couldn't escape the reality of what she had done, either. The video had been shared widely, and her face was just as exposed as his. The backlash was fierce. People weren't just questioning her judgment, they were attacking her. Her social media accounts were flooded with comments calling her racist, ignorant, and reckless. Friends she had known for years started to distance themselves, some even apologizing for not speaking up sooner about her behavior. It felt like a tidal wave crashing against her, one she wasn't prepared for. The guilt gnawed at her, but it was different from what she had expected. She had assumed she would feel justified, perhaps even vindicated by her actions. But instead, the more she thought about it, the more uncomfortable she became. What if she had misjudged him? What if she had let her own prejudices cloud her perception? She had tried to tell herself that she had acted out of caution, out of an instinct to protect others in the store, but that explanation felt hollow now. She couldn't ignore the sense that something was deeply wrong, that perhaps she had been wrong all along. But confronting that truth was harder than she had ever imagined. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from a friend, one she hadn't heard from in days. The message was short, blunt, "You need to make this right." Her stomach twisted. She had known it was coming. She had been waiting for the fallout, but now that it was here, she felt like she was sinking into a quicksand of her own making. The weight of the situation felt suffocating. She had expected this to be a simple matter, a small confrontation that would be forgotten in a few hours. But now, it had spiraled out of control, and she wasn't sure how to get back on solid ground. That evening, both of their worlds collided in a way neither could have predicted. The shopper sat at his small kitchen table, trying to focus on the emails piling up in his inbox, but his mind kept wandering back to the incident. He thought about the woman, about her expression when the guards arrived, and how quickly she had called for backup. The sense of injustice gnawed at him again, the weight of the situation pressing on his chest. He hadn't been the first person to face this kind of suspicion, but somehow, this time felt different. He couldn't ignore the feeling that the eyes of the world were on him now. And that was a terrifying thought. He checked his phone again, scrolling through a series of notifications. Some were supportive, some questioning him. But there, buried beneath the flood of comments, was one that stood out. It was a direct message. From her. "I need to talk to you," it said. "I made a mistake." He stared at the message for a long time. His first instinct was to delete it, to block her and move on. But something held him back. He had always prided himself on giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when they didn't deserve it. After a long moment, he typed out a short reply. "What do you want?" "I want to explain. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I saw something, and I panicked. I need to fix this." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with weight of what they both knew. He had no idea where this conversation would lead, but one thing was certain: the tension between them was undeniable, and it had only grown since that fateful day in the store. Meanwhile, the woman sat at her dining table, staring at the same message. Her heart raced as she reread her own words. The fear of what might happen next gripped her, but she knew she couldn't leave things as they were. If she didn't take responsibility for what she had done, if she didn't make an effort to make things right, she feared the consequences would haunt her forever. She thought back to the moment when she had first seen the shopper in the store, how she had watched him with suspicion, how she had assumed the worst. Her face burned with shame as she remembered her words to the security guards, her voice full of conviction, despite her gut telling her something wasn't right. Now, she couldn't escape the truth that she had let her own biases dictate her actions. The idea of facing him, of apologizing for what she had done, terrified her. She didn't know how to begin, didn't know if it was even possible to undo the damage she had caused. But she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that if she didn't try, she would never be able to live with herself. Their phones buzzed again, both at the same time. Both of them stared at their screens, the weight of the moment bearing down on them. He looked at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He could feel the tension building, the anticipation of what would happen next. Would this conversation lead to an apology? Would it resolve anything, or would it make things worse? She took a deep breath and typed, "I'm sorry. I was wrong." The shopper stared at the words. The apology was simple, but it felt like the beginning of something bigger. Could this be the first step toward understanding, toward healing the wounds they had both inflicted, whether they realized it or not? But as they both sat there, staring at their phones, neither of them knew what the next message would be, or how the story would end. The tension, thick with unresolved emotions, was building to a breaking point. It felt as though they were standing on the edge of something, waiting for the final moment to unfold. The apology hung in the air like a fragile thread, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though things might settle down, that the conflict might find its resolution. The shopper stared at the message, his fingers lingering over keyboard as he considered how to respond. He wanted to acknowledge her apology, to move forward, but something inside him hesitated. There was a part of him that still felt unsettled, unsure whether this was truly the right moment to forgive, to let go. But before he could type a response, his phone buzzed again, interrupting the stillness. This time, It was a news alert, a breaking story that made his heart stop. The headline was bold and glaring: "Viral mall incident leads to legal action against shoppers and store." The article was a mess of sensationalism, twisting facts and escalating the situation far beyond what had actually happened. It wasn't just about an accusation anymore, it was about a full-blown legal battle. The video that had gone viral was now being used as evidence in a larger investigation into retail discrimination and racial profiling. The woman's call to security, her words captured so clearly on video, had now taken on a life of its own. And as it spread across news outlets and social media platforms, it was no longer just a local incident, it was the focal point of an intense national debate. The shopper's stomach churned as he read through the details. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was now a headline story, a flashpoint in a much larger issue. The woman's actions, whether intentional or not, had sparked a firestorm of public opinion, and now people were picking sides, criticizing her for what they saw as blatant racial profiling, while others defended her, claiming she had simply been acting out of caution. The lines were drawn, and it felt like there was no middle ground. But that wasn't the worst part. As he continued reading, his eyes fell on the final sentence: "Both individuals involved in the incident have hired attorneys, and the store's corporate office is launching an internal review into its security procedures." His heart sank. Now, there was a real possibility of lawsuits and legal consequences. The words attorney and internal review loomed large, and for the first time, the shopper felt the weight of the situation crash down on him. This wasn't just an argument over a jacket, a quick confrontation in a boutique, it was spiraling into something much more dangerous. The woman, too, was sitting frozen as she read the same article. She had been bracing herself for some backlash, but nothing had prepared her for this. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, feeling a sense of dread she hadn't experienced in years.